Over the last 3 days of the Triduum, we heard, better yet, we've had proclaimed to us the story of our salvation. A story sprinkled with momentous moments. There was a moment lost in history when a God who needed no one shaped a man and a woman in his own image. There was the moment when God chose for himself a special people through whom all the families of the earth would be blessed. There was the midnight when the heavens opened and the very Son of the living God took our bone and blood from a young Jewish woman. And there was a dark afternoon when that very same God, in the flesh, uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. But marvelous as these were, creation and the covenant, the crib and the cross, they pale in comparison with this day. Indeed, without them today never would have been. And still, they are preludes, they are acts in a divine drama that has just reached its climax. He is not here. He has been raised. Two very simple sentences, and yet nothing remains simple after they are uttered, because the whole world has changed and the divine drama is all about this one event. He is not here. He has been raised. The Easter faith that Mark proclaims is surprisingly simple. It is a testimony that the Lord is alive and indeed has been raised. The grammarians among you will recognize that the verb refers to a very willful action on God's part. He has been raised. This is no accident, not simply some corpse being revived in a zombie apocalypse. No, this is about God fulfilling a promise, God taking an active role in history. It is a story in which a few women play a remarkable role. They followed Jesus from Galilee. They followed him to Golgotha. And when everybody else abandoned him, they remained at the foot of the cross. They had seen him breathe his last. They were there when he died. And now these same women return. They return to the garden on the first day of the week at daybreak. They come with spices and ointments for his battered body. But he is not there. The tomb is empty. And what they encounter is a young man sitting to the side of the tomb who asks them why they seek the living among the dead. The point is that these women are witnesses. They bear witness not to a dead Jesus, but to an empty tomb. They bear witness to a Christ who is not there, to a Christ who is alive. Not because they have seen him yet, there have been no apparitions just yet, but because his word has come through to them and has touched their hearts, has compelled them to proclaim to the 11 and to all the others that he is not there. The tomb is empty just as he said. What our faith professes is a truth as thrilling as it is profound. He has been raised. How are you supposed to prove that? How are you supposed to explain that 2,000 years later? And I think this is where faith comes in. Because this is not a story about explanation, nor is this a story about proof. Think of the gospel we just heard. They came to a tomb that was empty. There are a lot of different ways to explain that. Usually the simplest explanation is the best one. But to say that the Jesus who was buried there 3 days prior has been raised, that's when truth gets stranger than fiction. That's when the least plausible explanation is the actual one. Because across the centuries, our flawed humanity plays games with all of this. We are told that Jesus is indeed alive, and some will say only symbolically, or some might say only in our unforgettable memories as a living example, maybe as a good friend, that the world has tried to water down this story. But to be a Christian, I think, to be a Christian, you need to take Mark literally. That there was a Jesus, that he was put to death, that he was laid in a tomb, and 3 days later that same tomb was empty. The first day of the week, the tomb was empty for one reason alone, that God had fulfilled his promise of salvation. That the same Jesus who died in agony on Friday was alive again on Sunday. That he has been raised. Literally. He has been raised. Maybe we don't recognize him right away, not right off, not with a naked eye. After all, Mary Magdalene mistook him for the gardener. The two disciples who walked with him between Jerusalem and Emmaus talked for hours with him and thought he was a stranger. And the disciples on the shore of Tiberias thought he was a cook preparing breakfast. Thomas even put his finger into the wound on Jesus' side. None of them really understood it at first, but they all eventually recognized him. And then they came to realize that he was indeed in their midst. And they experienced him, they touched him, they saw him, they heard him, they spoke with him. They ate with him, they prayed with him, which is exactly what Peter is talking about in today's first reading. I am a witness, is what Peter claims. I am a witness to the risen Jesus, him who they crucified, him who they buried, him who was once again among us. The risen Jesus comes to us in ways that we do not understand, in ways that we can only imagine, and yet we don't really understand how the resurrection occurred. And I think that's okay. Because the important thing is to respond to the invitation of the encounter with the risen Lord. Because if this Jesus is anything other than what he claimed to be, then we are fools. Then we waste our lives in vain. We should all just go home and have utterly meaningless pursuits. All things would reduce to mere preference. Our whole world, our whole belief system, our hope in what comes after all of this, all of that is a farce. If, however, this Jesus is who he claims to be, love made manifest, then we owe him everything. No demand from the lover is ever too much for the beloved. Fittingly, too, on this Easter day, we give him our waiting with joy through suffering, through pain, through loneliness, that we may glimpse his pain in our own, so as to love as Jesus does. He has been raised. That's why we're all here. That is why we too testify to the encounter and experience of the risen Jesus. For the Lord is risen. The Lord is risen indeed.